This is section 8.3. It's on tests for parallelograms. All that means is they're going to give you a shape, and there's going to be certain marks on the shape, and those marks are going to tell you whether or not it's a parallelogram. So by definition, we know that a parallelogram has opposite sides parallel. Oh man, that was supposed to be a parallelogram. That's kind of what a parallelogram looks like. That means those marks need to look like this. These sides are parallel. Also, I'm using the same marks, just two of them, to show that these sides are parallel. That's a parallelogram by definition. But you could also show that something else is a parallelogram by making different marks there. So theorem 8.7 tells you this: if both pairs of opposite sides of a quadrilateral are congruent, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So that's what we have here in this diagram. If you have a four-sided figure where the opposite sides are congruent, then we know it's a parallelogram. Okay, so it's really just the converse of one of the theorems that we learned in last section. If it's a parallelogram, then opposite sides are congruent. Well, if opposite sides are congruent, then it's a parallelogram. Okay, so that's your first way. If the opposite sides are congruent, it's a parallelogram. Here's another way. This is theorem 8.9, and it's also the converse of another theorem. Last section, we talked about parallelograms having diagonals that bisect each other. Well, if you have a quadrilateral where the diagonals bisect each other, then that figure is a parallelogram. So if you see these marks on a shape, it's definitely a parallelogram. This one's new. This is theorem 8.8. It does not have a converse from last section. If one pair of opposite sides of a quadrilateral is parallel and congruent, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So here's what this looks like. We know the top and the bottom are parallel, but there's no marks on the left side and the right side. We also know that the top and the bottom are congruent. If that happens, then this shape is a parallelogram. So we don't need to know anything about one of the pairs of the opposite sides. As long as we know one pair of opposite sides are congruent and parallel at the same time, then it's a parallelogram. Okay, and then your last way, it's just the converse of another one that we learned. If you have a four-sided figure where the opposite angles are congruent, then that shape is a parallelogram. So in our next video, we're going to talk about showing whether or not these are parallelograms.